thank you so much. It's so great to be here with you all today. It's so great to be back in St. Louis. I don't get a chance to come back. As James said, I'm a graduate of St. Louis University, just down the way. My father, born and raised U City, went to SLU High. Family all are in the Clayton, U City area. So it's great to be here with all of you today. And you know, like James said, I come from a Catholic school background. So when we were asked to study this sort of phenomenon of schools that exist as Catholic schools and then decide to become charter schools at certain times, I would like to say that I was able to look at them as an entirely disinterested social scientist. And I was able to just the facts, you know, Joe Friday, look at it. But I have to say, you know, I have a personal stake in this. I'm a product of Catholic education. I taught in Catholic schools. I believe in the mission of Catholic education. So I offer that caveat at the beginning. I'm going to talk about some statistics. We'll talk about what we found and what possibly the implications are. But I want to place my biases up front. So this first graph we have here is looking at, if we just want to talk about private school enrollment in the United States as a percentage of the overall population of students, if we look over the past 114 years or so, you can actually see a sort of interesting trend. Those of you that are sort of economically minded, you see that actually private school enrollment tends to track pretty well with general economic health in the United States. So in the sort of post-war boom, we saw a large increase. In the sort of 1970s recessionary times, we see a decline. And the peak private school enrollment was right in late 1950s, early 1960s, at about 12% of the population. Today, a little under 10% of all students in the United States attend private schools. But while we see this sort of trend of ups and downs and dips and dives, when we talk specifically about Catholic schools, we actually see a very consistent pattern over time. So if we look at just the number of Catholic schools in the United States, 1979 to today, we see a very steady decline. And so those of you that are, you know, that work in Catholic schools or that know Catholic schools, you know they're the sort of very familiar trends. Traditionally, much of the labor force were priests and religious, and that the labor market has changed. The demographics of the neighborhoods in which many Catholic schools are located have changed. And generally speaking, this has driven a sort of decline in the number of schools over time. So Catholic school leaders today are facing a rapidly sort of changing marketplace in the neighborhoods that they serve. So I think the best example of this is in our paper. We did some sort of quantitative analyses, but then we also interviewed a lot of people that were involved. And this is a principal of Blessed Sacrament School in Washington, D.C., which I thought really kind of encapsulates what's happening in many Catholic schools. So it's, you know, traditionally the thought was, in a place like Washington, D.C., or perhaps in a place like St. Louis and other cities across the country, Catholic schools were the only option that many inner-city families had to get out of what at times were unperforming or outright dangerous public schools. Over the course of the last 10 or 20 years, we've actually seen an increase of supply of a new kind of schools that are offering parents more options, and these are public charter schools. So as James, I assume most of you are familiar with the public charter school, so it's sort of autonomously operated public school, but sort of much more free to design their own course of study, etc. And so this third sector, so where we previously had traditional public schools, and we had a small number of private schools, predominantly Catholic schools, but some other religious organizations that were there, we're seeing this third sector go up. And depending on where you are in America, so in Washington, D.C., about half of the students now attend charter schools. Here in St. Louis, I think it's around a third. 25%. Kansas City, it's about the same. Now in a place like New Orleans, it's 80 or 90% now. But depending on where you are, you see this growth. So what did we study? We looked at a particular phenomenon of a set of Catholic schools in 3 separate states. So 6 schools in the District of Columbia, 10 schools in the greater Miami area, and 2 schools in Indianapolis, Indiana, that were inner city Catholic schools that decided to become charter schools. Now it's important, and I always want to say when I talk about this, the verbs that we use are important, because initially I chose a very poor word when interviewing the leaders of these schools. And I said, oh no, so your Catholic school converted to a charter school. Word to the wise, was not the best choice to pick. So the phenomenon that we're specifically speaking about are schools that at the end of one academic year were a Catholic school, closed, reopened the next year as public charter schools. Now, there are various phenomena around the country of sometimes schools have been closed for several years and then they lease the building to charter school operators. It's not really what we're talking about here. Generally speaking, in the schools that we studied, the vast majority of the teachers stayed the same, students stayed the same, leadership stayed the same, at least in the short term. And what we were interested in studying was sort of what happens. What happens when these schools decide to switch? So what we did was we looked at, the grand total of it was 18 schools in those 3 areas. We used publicly available data to track enrollment and demographics over time, and also to try and, when we looked at these enrollment trends, we wanted to make sure that there wasn't some sort of secular trend, again, pardon the word, secular trend that was happening in the schools as well. So we matched them to some demographically similar private schools that did not close to track their enrollment over time. And really what we wanted to know, what was the effect of choosing to switch on these schools? And after we did that sort of quantitative analysis, we interviewed a lot of the key folks, the leaders of these schools, leaders in the archdioceses of these various areas, and asked them what their sort of perceptions of the event were. So if we start with their sort of quantitative findings, so the main thing that we found was that prior to switching, enrollment in all of these schools, this is just the average, but in all schools was at a very steady decline. And this time 0 is the year in which they switch. And in all of the schools post-switching, we saw a significant increase in the enrollment in the schools, right? So this makes a lot of sense if we think from a very basic level, is that they had to pay tuition to attend the Catholic schools, but when they were able to attend the charter schools, it was free. So if you have a good, even if people like it, but they have to pay for it, as the demographics change, difficult economic times, et cetera, we see a decline. Switch happens, it becomes free. More and more people are able to take advantage of it. Just to make sure that this wasn't a sort of demographic trend that was happening in the District of Columbia and Miami, we looked at very similar demographic schools, tracked them over the same time period. They saw basically a relatively steady enrollment or slight decline over time. So we think that this is actually an effect due to the switch that took place, not just a trend that was taking place in the city. Interestingly, we also looked at the percentage of minority students in those schools. And we see that while there was a steady increase in the number of minority students served, this is while they were still Catholic schools here, when they switched, they saw a marked uptick as they became charter schools. So you can see on average, 2 years after switching, the schools that made the switch were actually 93% minority students. And again, while we saw in our comparison schools a rough increase, nothing like what we saw there. So what does all of this mean when we look at all of these schools? It was tough because I have 2 things that I'm pretty sure about, and actually 4 sort of questions that actually digging into this stuff led me to perhaps more questions than answers. And I'm really excited actually to have this panel that follows us, because I think there'll be a great group of folks to actually dig into what these questions actually, what they mean. But there are 2 basic things that I can take away from this. So one of that is the idea that a sort of unbalanced school choice markets crowds out options for students. So what do I mean by that? So initially, if you think, we had those 2 big groups, right? So we had traditional public schools that are free to users, right? So they're free for kids to attend. And you had Catholic schools that you have to pay to attend, right? So that's the sort of marketplace that exists there. Families that are able to pay the tuition or have scholarship support are able to attend. I tend to think, and I would assume there are some charter school people in the room today, and so I don't mean to be presumptuous, but if I'm a betting man, which I occasionally am, I would say you didn't get into the charter school business to run Catholic schools out of business, right? Generally speaking, I think most people get into the charter school business because they see this large monolithic public school system that's not meeting the needs of students, and they want to have the opportunity to give students more choices. So the idea is to not, when you start charter schools, it's not to narrow the set of choices that students have, but in fact to increase the number of choices that students have. Now, this is the classic sort of law of unintended consequences. What we're seeing in places like Washington, D.C. and others, that actually, because charter schools are taking up more of the marketplace, students are actually having fewer options, meaning those students that want to attend Catholic schools are unable to do so. Now, that is really through no fault of charter school operators, right? So charter school operators just want to give kids more options. The problem is now you have 2 free options to users and 1 option that you have to pay for, right? So it's not surprising that more people are choosing to migrate to the free options as opposed to the one that you have to pay for. So how we design school choice markets matters. As long as we have options that are free to users or that are supported by public school dollars, or public dollars, and we have options that are not, we're going to continue to see students migrate from those that are not supported by public dollars to those that are supported by public dollars. Does that make sense? Let's see where all I see heads nod. Okay, fantastic. So I think those are kind of the 2 big sort of takeaways from this. But what I'm interested in sort of sharing with folks is that actually this raises some really interesting questions about the future of Catholic schools, the future of urban Catholic schooling, the future of just sort of urban schooling in general, because when we got into actually talking to the people that were making these types of decisions, it's great to have Corey here because he's one of them and can answer it as much as anybody. You know, my colleague who I wrote this paper with, Andrew Kelly, and I are both sort of by training, we're political scientists. And so we tried to view this through the lens of like, so using what we know about how businesses operate or how government operates, how do we describe this phenomenon and what it means? So one way is to use the classic, there's the classic economist Joseph Schumpeter, is this creative destruction? So what Schumpeter's argument in like the 1940s was is the way markets work is that, better options develop and take out the old one. So think of it, in your phone market, right? So the original brick cell phone that you had in the 1980s was $1,800, and it was this big, and it didn't work very well. And slowly over time, those went away, and new options replaced them, and those went away, and new options replaced them, and now we have the iPhone 5, right? Is this what we're seeing with schools, where this is just sort of these sort of Catholic schools, urban Catholic schools are just like not in a good position to meet the needs of students, and so they're just being sort of creatively destroyed in the sense that they're being taken away, and better options are coming in response to that. So that's sort of one way of looking at it. The other one is this sort of just organizational evolution. So is this the sort of future of Catholic schools in urban areas where they say, look, we as Catholic schools do a lot of different things, right? We educate students, we teach reading, we teach writing, we teach math, we impart faith. All of these things are part of it. If the impart faith piece is what is preventing access to public dollars, is it a sort of organizational evolution to say, well, we're just going to have to move that faith piece either before and after school or out of the school so that we can continue doing all of the other stuff that we want to do? Now, I'll be the first to say that when I went to the Catholic school leaders and offered this first scenario, it was roundly rejected. They said, no, this is not, being a Catholic school, the Catholic nature of it is the heart of what we do. It is central to what we do. You cannot simply say, we're going to get rid of religion and the school's going to be the same. They, to a person, said, our schools died, a new one began, and they were not happy about this. The other way to look at it is this sort of like, using like a business example, is this sort of divestiture. So if we think about this in businesses, large organizations that sometimes spin off their less well-able parts of their work. So if it's, McShane Tool and Die, the tool part might be making a lot of money, but the die part might not be making that much money. So you sell off those assets and focus on the sort of tool section. That's what's happening here in Catholic schools. So if we look at Catholic schools all across the country, is this large, there's 6,000 of them, some of which are doing well, some of which are doing poorly. Is the strategy of Catholic school leaders in the future to try and sort of divest, meaning take the urban Catholic schools or other ones that are seeing declining enrollment and having problems, sort of selling those off or leasing them to charter school operators, et cetera, and then focusing on the schools that are economically viable. One thing that is important to note is that in all of these cases in Washington, D.C., in Miami, and in Indianapolis, these new charter schools have become serious revenue streams for the archdioceses, to the nature of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, by leasing the buildings to charter schools, which then they have been able to turn around and use to offer scholarships to students to the remaining Catholic schools. So in a place like Washington, D.C., where there used to be about 20 inner-city Catholic schools, and there are now 6, all of the sort of leases for all those buildings are providing those scholarships for students. And then finally, I think one of the more interesting looks of this is the question of institutional isomorphism. So for those of you that were educated in Catholic schools in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, if you went into what we consider the sort of high-performing charter schools of today, I think they'd look really, really similar to what you had. Now, there might not be the nuns, and there may not be the rulers or whatever, but they're actually very similar. And so one of the things that's really interesting of this is that a lot of high-performing charter schools have basically borrowed so many of the practices of Catholic schools, right? Strict discipline, uniforms, high expectations, character development, care for the whole student. So if you're looking at it from the perspective of the low-income inner-city student, this is a great thing, right? More students have access to character education, to discipline, to high academic expectations. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of a Catholic school leader, that's tough. Someone is basically mimicking a large part of the product that you provide and is doing it at a cost that is free to the student. So that's a problem from the Catholic school perspective. So we have this knowledge that these schools that switched were able to increase their enrollment, increase their minority enrollment. All of them now are on a strong financial track. They've been helpful for all of those. But how we answer these type of questions of what this all means matters for how we move forward. If you care about Catholic schools, if you care about charter schools, if you care about urban education, understanding how these forces interact with one another, how they learn from one another, and sometimes they compete with one another is extremely important. And I think that's all I'm going to say to y'all. And then I'd love to join with some folks and chat about it. Thank you.